Everyday life is difficult and full of painful emotions. Throughout our lives, starting from childhood, we tend to leave behind unprocessed emotions, feelings that we simply don't know what to do with. As a consequence, these emotions become rigid and maladaptive because they don't allow us to have a nuanced and constructive way to adapt to different situations that elicit an emotional reaction from us. Someone who experienced rejection or abandonment in childhood may have developed over time an intense fear or anxiety in situations where they perceive a risk of being left out or rejected. They might react with panic even in relatively harmless scenarios such as a friend rescheduling plans or when not receiving an immediate response to a text message. But this maladaptive reaction is just an echo from previous similar painful experiences. So when we're faced with these rigid, maladaptive emotional reactions, over time we actually often develop secondary processes to cope. These secondary processes are what we can call internal splits, and they typically manifest in one of two ways. The first being as secondary cover-up emotions. For example, in the case of the person fearing abandonment, they might in turn get angry so as to try to cope or distance themselves from the fear. The second type of secondary process would be emotional suppression. This can look like dissociation or inappropriate laughter, for example. Both secondary emotions and emotional suppression could be seen as attempts to manage or control our underlying vulnerable primary emotions, but they don't actually satisfy their underlying needs.
Nice.
And so what happens is we split into a vulnerable part and into another that's trying to protect that vulnerable part. We'll call it the protector or the suppressor in the case of emotional suppression. In therapy, at some point, we are likely to get tears in our eyes just getting a bit in touch with something painful. And in the next moment, we may scoff and say,
"Well, it is what it is."
And here a couple of things could happen. In the case of a so-called soft interruption, when we raise awareness of this emotional change from intense to very much reduced, we can somewhat easily get back on track. We point it out, we understand why it happens, that it's sort of a defense mechanism, and we can later get back into it. Now, that's not the case for hard interruptions. In their case, once it closes, that emotional door will not open again, and we have to address it as a self-standing topic. And here one key aspect of therapy is that we follow the pain, or as it's also called, the pain compass, because the pain leads us to what really matters. So that's why it's important to address these interruptions, because they steer us away from what is crucial to get into. And for actually addressing this type of interruption, what happens in emotion-focused therapy, which is what I'm getting trained in, is that we can approach this internal split between the vulnerable part of us, the one that felt the intense fear of abandonment in our previous example, and the part of us that does the emotional suppression through a dialogue, or as it's called, a two-chair dialogue. The way a two-chair dialogue goes needs in itself at least a separate video, but in short, the client will enact their inner suppressor, telling the vulnerable part why they're doing it, and then the vulnerable part can reply with what the consequences of that emotional suppression are. As this dialogue progresses, the client essentially gets to better understand what they're feeling, or rather what they're afraid of feeling, and why it is important to get to those feelings. And the resolution of this internal conflict, albeit complex as is the entire process, involves at least a few things. First of all, the client gets to be aware and to express what they need, such as to be allowed to feel and process their own emotions. And as for the internal conflict, the split, it will dim out and the two sides will actually start to integrate and even sort of cooperate into something more functional and adaptive.
Am I chair?
wake up every day, I have some food and everything seems like it's going to be fine. Then all of a sudden shit